Hello and welcome to the time management video in our How to Audition series. In this video we discuss how best to use the time you have before your audition, help you come up with a practice plan, and help you to feel as prepared as possible before the day. A motivational speaker once told me about the jar of life. It's a good story and it has a ring of truth to it. And in the years since, I've often thought back to it when I'm preparing for an important concert or event. The story goes like this. A professor stands before his class with a bag, from which he takes a large empty jar and some rocks. He fills the jar to the top with the rocks and asks his student, "Is the jar full?" The students look at the rocks in the jar, think for a moment and answer, "Yeah. The jar is full." The professor smiles, reaches into his bag and takes out small pebbles, adding them to the jar, shaking the jar a little to disperse the pebbles amongst the larger rocks. Then he asks again, "How about now? Is the jar full now?" The students start to think this is a trap, but reluctantly agree that the jar is now full. The professor then takes out sand, pours it into the jar, filling up the remaining empty space. "The jar is your time," he says, "and if you start by filling it with the small stuff, you'll never fit in those bigger tasks. The ones that matter most." It's a good story showing that your time is a limited resource, and that if you know what you want and prioritize intentionally, usually you can find a way to realize your goals. But there are some obvious problems when applying it to auditions. First, each jar is going to be a different size. How soon you need to perform will change how much preparation is possible. Second, the size and ratio of rocks, pebbles, and sand will change. Auditions have different requirements, both in terms of priorities and repertoire. Third, most people's jars come partly pre-filled. Auditions overlap with learning other repertoire, and commitments don't just go away when you have an important audition. Without figuring out what size jar you're working with, or in which order to fill it with the changing ensembles of rocks, pebbles, and sand, you're not going to fit everything in. It can quickly become complicated. So let's simplify things a bit. What is the ideal? How do you want to feel when you get up to play? I want to feel unbeatable. When I'm under pressure, I want a bulletproof preparation. My dad used to go to extreme lengths to make sure he was prepared. At the end of his preparation, he'd perform with intentional distractions, leaving the TV on to test his concentration, and opening the windows in wintry London, so he knew how his fingers coped with a cold venue. These tend towards the extreme, but seeing what goes wrong under pressure lets you know what to focus on in your practice. I recommend planning plenty of time after your preparation for mock auditions. If it's an important audition, I'll leave up to 2 weeks after I'm fully prepared just to play through my program and see what happens. This builds stamina and helps you acclimatize. In an ideal world, we'd be fully prepared before every audition. We'd memorize all the markings in all the repertoire and have a thorough understanding of the context of pieces. We'd have the chance to experiment with many different fingerings, bowings, and phrasings, and we'd have rehearsed our audition in front of an audience enough to overcome any nerves. Ideally, we'd have unlimited time. Since we don't, it's important to develop an understanding of how we learn, how long we need, and what we find most difficult. We also need to realize that there are those situations where the time just isn't enough, and all we can do is our best. This should, however, be the exception and not the rule. Preparation, boiled down to its simplest, falls into 4 basic parts. 1. Understand an outline of the works, including context, length, and difficulty. 2. Learn what's on the page. 3. Develop a realization of what's written with large and small phrasings. And 4. Perform the audition in front of people until you feel completely comfortable. Auditions often have commonalities between excerpts and own choice pieces, so you may be able to skip some of these steps, but often there will be repertoire that you still need to learn from scratch. Learning repertoire on a schedule is a daunting challenge. Students and professionals will pick up a piece and spend most of their time perfecting the first 20 bars before realizing how many more pages there are to learn. If we compare it to the jar analogy, it would be akin to picking up a fistful of rocks, pebbles, and sand together and dumping them into the jar without looking at what remains. Unsurprisingly, this often fails. The key then is to make a plan from the outside in to cover all the repertoire. Learning from the outside in means considering the whole situation before zooming in on the details. So how do you construct a plan? Well, we can use the jar of life as an analogy. The questions you need to answer are, how big is your jar? And what are the rocks you're going to fill it with? Say you have 8 weeks until your audition. Now we know how big the jar is. Let's reserve the last 2 weeks for performance practice, getting comfortable, building stamina, and small tweaks. That leaves 6 weeks. At the end of the 6 weeks, you need to be ready with all your repertoire. Ideally, the pieces would be ready at around the same time so that they stay fresh. Also ideally, you can use your time as efficiently as possible, not repeating sections that you already know when you could be fixing something that's not as good. There are some obvious rocks with which to start your plan. Learning the structure and contents of the works is non-negotiable. It takes a little bit of time, but shouldn't be overly burdensome and makes the rest of the journey much easier. You then need to learn the notes. After that is a good time to learn the music in and between the notes, like the articulation, dynamics, and phrasings. These are your big priorities, and they can be filled in with the pebbles and sand of exactly what sound, timbre, and expression you want. Having all these rocks is a great start, but prioritizing exactly how much time to give each one can seem difficult. So I like to simplify things a bit. Most people would agree that if piece A is 1 page long and piece B is 2 pages long, then piece B will take longer to learn. Probably around about twice as long. Then what about piece C? Piece C is also only 1 page long, but is twice as difficult as A. In my experience, piece C will take at least twice as long to learn as piece A. Learning what you find difficult takes time, but with practice and self-awareness, it becomes possible to put pieces on a scale. I like 1 to 10 for difficulty. Keep in mind the different factors to consider. Technical difficulty is the most obvious, but musical difficulty is a tricky thing to track, and often the excerpt we least suspect reveals its teeth during the preparation phase. Because of this, it's good to stay a little bit flexible with your practice schedule. Here's a method I like to use to figure out how much time to spend on each work. Bear with me on this. It sounds complicated, but in essence it's the same as the above example. I find Strauss Don Juan excerpt difficult. For me, it's a 9. Brahms' Second Symphony, second movement is much easier for me. It's only a 4. Strauss is also longer at 1 minute 45, as opposed to the Brahms, which is only 1 minute 10. I need to spend more time on the Strauss, as it happens over 3 times as much time. To easily compare the time investments of the two pieces, you can simply multiply the difficulty number by the number of minutes. My number for Strauss is 15.75 and my number for Brahms is 4.67. It's vital to know that these numbers are to find a comparison. They are not absolute. They're as accurate as your difficulty rating, and if something isn't working for you, feel free to change it to make it work. Once we work out the numbers for all the pieces in our program, we can add them together to work out a total. Then each piece's number becomes a percentage of that total. For example, if all the repertoire in my program amounted to 60 and I was preparing Strauss for an audition, I'd spend about 26% of my time practicing it. How did we get to that number? Well, 15.75 divided by 60 equals 0.2625, and that's about 26%. Obviously, your numbers and your experience will vary. With the percentages worked out, it's much easier to put a practice plan together. Aim for each piece to be ready near the end of your preparation time, and plan a deadline for each stage of learning. Even without the convoluted maths, you can come up with a plan in the following way. Let's use an example of Don Juan, Brahms excerpt, Haydn D Cello Concerto, and a Lindbergh excerpt. This list has a variety of different piece difficulties and lengths. I find the Lindbergh long and difficult, requiring the most time. The Haydn Concerto is long, but it's familiar to me, so that requires slightly less time. The Don Juan is short but difficult enough to require some time, and the Brahms is short and less difficult for me, needing the least time overall. With a 6-week plan, we can work backwards. The last week and a half is for performance practice, leaving us with 4.5 weeks. In the last half of week 4, most of the preparation should be done. Your focus here is going to be on phrasing and expression. In the 4th week, you'll be cleaning up your shifts and ensuring that you're following all the dynamics, articulation, and expressive markings, also really locking down all your bowings and fingerings. In the 3rd week, you start to work technically with the Brahms. The goal this week is to have all the notes learned and comfortable. In the 2nd week, you start to work with Don Juan and Haydn. In the second half of the 1st week, you start to work on the Lindbergh. The first few days is reserved for analysing the pieces and reading up on them. If the orchestra you're auditioning for has recorded these pieces, it's a good idea to listen to those recordings. By working this way, overlapping the repertoire with an easier piece as you become more familiar with it, you can keep up the intensity of your work and have a polished product in time for your audition. I've repeatedly mentioned playing in front of people, and it's with good reason. Your body responds differently in a stressful situation than it will in a practice room. Playing through your entire program without the ability to stop and fix something is a great way of testing your preparedness. In situations where you can't easily gather a class of colleagues or a group of friends, videotaping yourself and watching back is a great way of making yourself nervous. Treat it as the real deal and don't allow yourself to stop, otherwise it doesn't work. Watching the video back will give you an insight on what the panel will see when you play. It can be daunting, and that's kind of the idea, but this is the best way for you to improve. Try to do it every day for several days before your audition outside of your practice. Ideally, your mock auditions will take place at around the same time as your audition. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. It's fine to talk about making a plan, but life gets in the way. Plans get messed up and auditions come before we're ready. Write your plan down, print it out, hang it somewhere visible. The easier it is to see what you need to do, the harder it is to pretend that you don't know what you should be doing on that day. Have an accountability buddy. If you know another person who's preparing for something, have a check-in with them to make sure you're both working towards your goals. Celebrate small victories. Every time you stick to your plan, you're making your future brighter. You're getting closer to that job, or simply playing your best, and that's something to celebrate. Practice with love for what you're doing. Most importantly, when you miss a deadline or you feel frustrated, keep at it. Audition preparation can be grueling, but remember that you're playing amazing music, and every step you make with your preparation brings you closer to that ideal. If you manage your time properly, you should be ready for your audition. I hope you can use some of the tips in this video and enjoyed learning more about time management for auditions. If you have any questions, comments, or time management tips of your own, please post them down below. If you like this video, you might be interested in our learning excerpts video, or one of the other videos in our How to Audition for Musicians series. Thanks for watching. Remember to click the like video if you liked it, and subscribe for more videos like this one.